Hi, I'm live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you guys. This time talking about The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. The Right Stuff is a kind of extended narrative nonfiction report on the early days of the American space program. Specifically, a lot of the focus is on the astronauts. There are 7 men. They're all men, of course, in the time, who are picked for the first wave of astronauts for manned space flight through NASA's particular system, and that becomes a kind of big thing because one of the back and forths in the story is about the different sort of space related programs, the different rocketry related programs that are going on in different places, and especially the tension between this sort of the new breed, for lack of a better term, of astronauts versus the more traditional, though it's still a very, very new field at the time, of super high end piloting. All of the pilots who are involved in some of the most intense airplanes, and some of them even they're in a sense hybrid planes, in that they rely on the basic mechanics of airfoils for flight when they're in atmosphere where there's it low enough to the earth where there's enough atmosphere to use that, but they also have rockets built into them, or rockets as even sometimes the main engines, and so it's not that distinct from the way that NASA's flight system works, in the sense of using a rocket to put a person way up in the air. It's just closer to the sort of traditional flying experience. And one of the points of contention between these two programs is that, flying like an X-1 plane that is basically a rocket by itself, it's just sort of shaped a little more like a plane, is something that a pilot does. Fundamentally, a pilot is in control of the whole system, like a pilot would be in any number of other planes, versus the Mercury manned space flight systems, where there's a lot of stuff about the idea that they could, have a trained chimpanzee do it. And in fact, they send chimpanzees up in these missions before they send humans up in these missions. Not identical missions, but essentially a proof of the same concept. They're able to measure, record the measurements of a whole lot of different health considerations of what will happen when a person ends up, out into space. How does their body respond to weightlessness and all of that sort of stuff. And that's, as you might imagine, the pilots are kind of always pushing back against the astronauts with the line about, well, it's basically just a trained monkey thing, which is, part of the sort of dramatic tension of the story. The titular right stuff refers to this kind of core idea that Tom Wolfe has, that there is a particular blend of characteristics, one of which is understanding immediately that you can't talk about any of these characteristics, and that this is part of the mystery around these super high intensity pilots. But that this, especially the test pilots, they're the pilots who are flying planes before, often before they've got into kind of complete production, testing the limits of what these new airframes can handle, which, as you can imagine, is pretty dangerous, because they, end up at the envelope, at the pushing the envelope, pushing the limits, getting right to the very edge of what the plane can actually handle. And sometimes you end up over, and that's probably, sometimes that's it, and sometimes people survive. But there are a lot of, and the first, I don't know, quarter of the book is a lot about just the kind of casualty rates of pilots in these programs, not even at war, but basically kind of preparing for the possibility of going to war, which is pretty sobering, and is part of why, I mean, the Tom makes the case that later on, once all of these men who have been test pilots in most cases have been chosen to be astronauts as part of the kind of remarkable flavor of kind of astronaut stoicism as being related to all of this much less visible but no less dangerous work that many of the men involved have been doing, and that their families have been aware of, and all of that sort of stuff. So, like I said, the book starts off mostly being about pilots. There's a fair bit about kind of what the cutting edge of airplane piloting for the military is like in the sort of post-war 40s, and then in the early and even into the mid 50s. There's a discussion of Chuck Yeager, who, if you don't know, was the first person to break the sound barrier and survive, I guess you could say. I don't know. There's some discussion of some of the other people who had attempted it, all of whom hadn't succeeded in the survival part, and probably didn't actually break the sound barrier in the first place. So one of the points that is made is that Chuck Yeager himself has the kind of intuitive deduction that actually all of this instability that happens as you get closer and closer to Mach 1, the speed of sound, that will fade away very quickly as you get past Mach 1. And so your instability approaching the barrier will not maintain. And so this is sort of part of what makes the push for breaking the sound barrier so important. Anyway, so there's a lot of discussion about that, and then we get into gradually a sort of greater understanding of what the space race is like, because obviously one of the sort of core things going on is that the Soviets also have a rocket program, and the Soviets are ahead of the American rocket program, but at the same time, one of the kind of core refrains at this point in the story is that while the Soviets are ahead, they're probably not nearly as far ahead as the kind of common individual, and even not as far ahead as many of the various politicians who have access to a lot more information than a just a regular kind of off the street citizen. That despite having all this extra information, they don't realize that the American space program is actually not as far behind as it seems. They just publicize a lot of their stuff a lot more, and so when the American, what is has at the time of the book at this point has just recently become NASA, when they have a rocket that doesn't get off the launch pad, or a rocket that gets up into the air a little bit and then has to be aborted and destroyed without any manned systems on it, that people see that and think, oh, our rockets never go up into space, and the Soviets are able to do that, and that actually the distinction, or at least what is the belief among all of these NASA scientists and engineers, is that actually they're not nearly as far behind as some of the people seem to think, despite Sputnik happening first, despite the first manned orbit happening on the Soviet side first. That basically all of these kind of milestones are done by the Soviets before the Americans get to them, but they're not actually that far behind, and that this is a reason to be really aggressive about the program, is that they can still catch up, and if they're willing to put money and resources into it, and that it is not nearly as kind of immensely unsafe as all of these testing failures would suggest, because the testing failures aren't really failures. They are just evidence of testing the limits of all of these systems that are going to be important not to fail when you have an actual, a person in the pod at the top of a rocket. which is really it's an interesting kind of whole section because you have this sort of tension between all of these different individuals and groups, the NASA scientists and engineers and officials in kind of one, for lack of a better term, faction, and the test pilots who then become the astronauts as sort of another group that has a very different set of expectations and set of desires for this whole project. Then you have a political element where different politicians have different expectations. John F. Kennedy being, of course, a major player in eventually driving the space race forward, despite some setbacks and in part as a result of the successes of these kind of early flights. But you have a whole thing of, the astronauts want to pilot the rocket, and the scientists and engineers want them to be sort of available as backup but not actually to do very much piloting themselves, just so that they can't mess up anything as much as anything. The idea being that it's a you know huge complicated system, and that it really is dependent on the mechanical innovations and technologies at play more so than the skill of a pilot in the capsule, and that becomes a major point of contention throughout the story. But eventually, of course, you end up with a set of 7 pilots who have been chosen as astronauts. There's a whole discussion about how they chose them, and one of the details being that NASA originally has planned that they don't really need talented pilots for this because they don't really want the pilots to do much piloting. Um, and what either Dwight Eisenhower or someone in his cabinet or somewhere up the line realizes is that if they just put out a sort of mass call for astronauts, they're going to get flooded with all sorts of people. And that all of these men who are currently serving as pilots in the military can just be told, hey, if you want to volunteer, you can. And they've already been, they already have a lot of physical health data on them, and they already have uh, fairly extensive records about them, and they have been cleared for whatever kind of security clearances are necessary, all of that sort of stuff. And so they end up pulling from the test pilots, which, like I said, becomes a sort of major point of contention later on in the story. It's one of the kind of interesting places. And then, of course, once there are 7 men selected to be astronauts, it becomes, in some ways, even more chaotic because now you have this whole specific set of individuals and their presentation of their kind of their beliefs, and they become overnight celebrities, and everybody wants to hear about them and about their families and how did their wives take all of this and all of this sort of stuff back and forth that is difficult and unexpected in a lot of ways for most of them. They all seem to think that they're doing something that is sort of at the cutting edge of American flight and space systems, but not realizing just how much they're going to become celebrities and totally become household names is another interesting thing. And it's sort of the core of the book in some ways is, well, Tom Wolfe describes it as attempting to understand what it is that unites all of these characters, these astronauts in particular, this idea of the right stuff, this particular set of qualities that are present in the sort of highest echelon of piloting, and that also present in astronauts. And that it's this kind of combination of courage with intelligence and with the sort of being able to keep your cool in these chaotic moments, as well as being willing to go into danger while also kind of understanding and being very clear-sighted and logical about the nature of that danger and all of these different kind of things that come into play. And in particular, that it's something that is very easy to lose, and so there is a kind of continual cutting down of the men, because they are all men in this story at the kind of highest reaches of this, that every layer of the pyramid takes more of them away until you end up with just the absolute best of the best at the very top, and that this is a sort of the highest reaches of this particular type of excellence. And the question of whether astronauts are the sort of definitive example of that is one of the things that the book is about. And it's really interesting, in part because one of the continual refrains in the reporting is that all of the civilians are much more interested in kind of the nature of these astronauts and who they are as people than they are interested in the technical advances that allow for the project to go forward, and all of the things that the scientists and the engineers have been doing behind the scenes to allow for something like this. Which is funny, because this is a book that is definitely also much more interested in the nature of the character of these men than it is in any of the scientific or technical advances that allow for this whole project to go forward. So it's kind of a funny little kind of meta commentary on the commentary around these characters in some sense. But anyway, it's a really fun story. I think it's really, it's very compelling in terms of hearing about these characters. It's full of all of these larger than life characters who are all kind of blending a different combination of these martial virtues in together, and I think makes for a really kind of fascinating story about basically all of these people and all of their um, kind of the combination of factionalism and intrigue alongside the working together to try to win the space race. And at the end of the book, they haven't won. Is part of it is that the book ends with the next round of astronauts having been selected, and so now there are a couple more, but the Soviets are still in the lead, probably not as far in the lead as lots of people think, but the Soviets had the first man in orbit. They had the first multi-mission connection where they sent up um, essentially two pods at once, in orbit, in synchronized orbits. They had the first woman in space, also, all of these different things, but the sort of NASA assumption that they are behind by, maybe a matter of months or even weeks, not by years or decades, despite the public perception that is, of course, leading to the eventual Apollo missions and the landing on the moon and all of that sort of stuff. So, anyway, it's a really, like I said, it's a fun book with all of these kind of compelling historical events, that is, I think, worth checking out if you're interested in um, flying or in space or whatever else that's sort of broadly related to the things at stake in the story. Because I really do think that this is a great demonstration of narrative nonfiction as storytelling. It's a really fun story to be told in here. So yeah, totally worth checking out. I can't speak necessarily to its in like complete validity as storytelling. It seems to me, not knowing everything about this, but it seems like there are places where the story has been presented in a sort of partisan way, I guess you might say, that Tom Wolfe has the things that he's interested in and the things that he's not as interested in, and that has perhaps played a factor. Like I said, so much of the story is about these characters more than it is about, the technical advances or anything like that. And I think that plays a part in some ways, but it's still really, a lot of fun to read. Um, so yeah, that is going to be it for today. I hope you have enjoyed this further episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads. Check out The Right Stuff. If it sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments if you have read it and have thoughts on it. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody, and have fun reading.